Welcome to the History in 60 podcast, a companion series to AMI's History in 60, hosted by John Lepke, exploring powerful moments in Canada's disability history. Here in the podcast, we take a deeper dive through conversations with guests who are shaping disability culture and history today.
When you think about dance, it's often framed around precision, uniformity, and bodies moving in very specific ways. For a long time, that definition left many disabled dancers out of the picture entirely. But over the past several decades, disabled artists, choreographers, and companies have challenged what dance can look like, expanding movement vocabularies, redefining technique, and creating inclusive spaces where access is part of the artistry itself. Beyond performance, inclusive dance has always been about access. Access to training, to creative process, to storytelling, and to history itself. Our guest today, Dr. Kelsie Acton, has spent her career thinking about and working inside these questions, especially how access is felt and negotiated in the body through dance. Through her writing and creative work, she explores how movement, space, and access shape the experiences of disabled performances and audiences alike.
Hi, I'm Kelsie Acton. I am currently talking to you from London, England. Behind me are a glimpse of my walls, which are painted the particularly hideous shade that many rentals in London are, which is called magnolia yellow. I'm a white woman in my early 40s. I've got long brown hair that's pulled back and clear glasses. And today I'm wearing a black t-shirt and a lavender sweater.
Thank you. And I am coming to you from a hotel conference room turned wonderful podcast studio with the History in 60 logo behind me on Treaty 6 in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. I gave a little bit of an intro to start us off, Kelsie, but for those who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about your career and how you ended up in the work that you're doing, how it intersects with inclusive dance practice?
Sure. So I think my career's been pretty eclectic and wandering, but I see it as being roughly organized around three key ideas of access, disability culture, and performing arts. So I started off as a dance artist. I worked for a long time in Edmonton, Alberta, where I was co-artistic director of Cripsie, which is an integrated disability dance company there. And I taught a lot of inclusive dance classes. Part of that work was producing performance, and through that, I got really interested in audiences. About a year before I finished my PhD at University of Alberta, I applied, mostly so I could meet Jess Thom, to the position of Inclusive Practice Manager at Battersea Arts Centre, which was about to launch as the world's first relaxed venue, following a methodology by Jess Thom of Tourette's Hero.
And for those who don't know, who is Jess Thom? Not to hopefully bump you off track, but
Jess Thom is a superstar. She's an artist with Tourette's, and her company, Tourette's Hero, is dedicated to the idea that Tourette's is this incredible creative force. Where her story very much intersects with mine and where she made my career possible in many ways is that she has been a huge force in the UK and around the world advocating for relaxed performances. Because Jess has very obvious tics, and theaters are incredibly hostile and unwelcoming environments if those performances aren't relaxed. So after I spent about 4 years at Battersea Arts Centre working on access there. And since then, my career has been a mix of access work, sometimes for audiences, sometimes for artists or arts workers, sometimes as a plain language writer. I've worked a lot with the Critical Design Lab, and I'm now at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. I don't do as much dance these days, aside from my own pleasure, but the last couple of years I've been writing more about dance as an academic, particularly about dance by artists with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
And what do you think it takes? The episode that this podcast is connected to is looking at inclusive dance, disability-led dance in various ways, from where we're looking at sort of mixed ability spaces to educational resources for wheelchair-using dancers. In your experience, what do you think it takes to create an inclusive dance space that honors the disability identity in the room?
Could probably spend about 2 years talking about this. But despite the fact my brain loves details, we're going to attempt to keep this high level. For me, the first thing is really clear values and practices and commitments that the space will hold no matter what. I am not a fan of saying that spaces are for everyone. No spaces for everyone. But for me, the ethics are about being really clear about who you're excluding and why. So for example, I don't think a good inclusive dance space is going to let somebody who is really invested in understanding disability as an individual tragedy spend a lot of time telling disabled dancers that they should try yoga and gratitude. That is not an inclusive space.
Are you telling me that doesn't work, Kelsie? I've been doing it all wrong.
I mean, if it works for you, I'm very supportive of this. But
holds up British sign that says sarcasm on it. Yes.
I'm not opposed to yoga or gratitude, but they should not be imposed on people. You have to have a lot of clarity and a really hard line around your values and approaches. And then within those values, I think a lot of it is about listening to each other, experimenting with the best, most joyful ways to move, to be together, because every group of dancers is going to bring a different set of access needs and a different set of interactions with each other into the space. And for me, that's like the great joy of disability culture, is this endless iterative figuring out of how we can be and make art together.
In the episode, we point to a number of Canadian, British, American companies. We could have gone further if only there were, like you said, 2 years to describe them all. Who are some of the companies that you point towards in the history of inclusive and disability-led dance? And they can be from anywhere in the world.
So I think I have a really academic answer to this and a very personal answer to this.
Let's start with the personal.
Like, I started doing disability dance in Edmonton, and there were not a lot of models around. So for me, my touch points were very much about who was putting their work on the internet. So I think about, I used to sit at my government day job and watch this video of Mark Brew's work by Access. Full of Words, I think, is the piece, and just like on loop in the background while it's taking calls. And then I think about Stopgap. Also had put a number of their videos or clips of their work on their website, and I would just sit there and watch those over and over and over again. Stopgap is from England. They're in Farnham, which is a little place just outside of London, which I think brings me to the sort of like more cranky academic answer, which is, I think a lot of disability arts history is not documented. I think the people I was encountering were the people who had the resources to put their work on YouTube or on the internet. So we've got artists self-documenting, and then we also have people like me writing about disability dance. And I think this is something I've written a lot about with my friend and collaborator, Sydney Ehrlich. There's real biases about whose work is documented, particularly in academic spaces. Dancers with intellectual and developmental disabilities have been there since the start of the disability arts movement, but their histories and their artwork often aren't documented or aren't documented as art. In the same way, say, wheelchair users who I think fit non-disabled public's understanding of what disabled people look like get documented.
The Super-Crips get to use the quasi-academic term, do tend to get the lion's share of for those who don't know what a Super-Crip is, it's sort of this idea that often attributed to Paralympians, but can fit into art spaces as well, of the sort of not only the overcoming narrative, but the sort of disability as superpower, which can be good sometimes for a self-actualization in some ways, but Super-Crip can kind of run away with the oxygen in the room.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah.
Kelsie, one of the things I bumped into and we it's not an I, it's a we bumped into creating this episode, is that when it comes to inclusive dance, I mean, I've already said it during this interview, there's disability-led dance, there's inclusive dance, and everybody calls it something slightly different. The root's often the same. What do you think of that paradigm, and how have you seen that happen when you've had to zoom out for this sort of academic study of inclusive dance?
I mean, you can hear me switching between language as we talk. So I think changing terminology in disability dance, inclusive dance, mixed ability, whatever we want to call this, is, I think, tied to changing terminology around disability and access more generally. In some ways, artists are doing new things. They want to invent language that is going to be specific and concise, that's going to hopefully clearly communicate what they want to do with their art. And that's super important. But also, I will say, as somebody who loves plain language, anytime we start inventing new terms or defining new terms, sometimes we've just created a barrier to people understanding. We have to go back to explain those terms. The second thing that's happening is, I know we're trying to get away from stigma, but the problem is that stigma follows us around. So I think when I was first starting to work in this space, inclusive dance was the terminology we were using a lot because we felt like mixed ability implied maybe only a mix of physical abilities, and we wanted to think broader than that. But then I know for some people, inclusive has acquired, I'll say, like a stain of education talk. So to be clear from that, I think people hear inclusive, they think of inclusive education, where people sometimes have really terrible experiences and they don't want to use that word. So they find a new one. It's important for people to have language that they feel good about. And also, I think we end up endlessly changing language instead of tackling the stigma sometimes.
One of the groups that we spoke to, Pushmakers, really focuses on wheelchair using curriculum. And I know we just talked about how, disability-led dance is more than wheelchair users. And the episode certainly makes that point. But I'm curious your thoughts on the importance of creating these sorts of educational materials, whether it's for wheelchair users, whether it's for creating plain language resources so that those with certain forms of disability can feel more prepared and included in those spaces. What are the importance of that sort of curriculum piece?
I think these projects are incredibly important. I think, firstly, just the fact that they're out there, they exist on the internet. I think disabled people find a whole lot on the internet. Disabled people are often incredible at working search engines, and we have to be because often we're isolated. So there's an important representation piece there. I also think, and this is something I learned from Alice Shepard, disabled dancers often have to essentially invent their own individualized technique that's really specific to their bodies and minds. A resource like Pushmakers is not going to get somebody all the way there, but it means they have a jump start on developing that technique. It means the dancer can engage with that resource and, not spend 3 years doing wheelchair basketball in an attempt to learn the technique for dance. I mean, not that wheelchair basketball is awesome. I have nothing against it.
That's fine. Kelsie is describing part of my career, I think, in that it's certainly like it took some collaborator when I moved into more artistic spaces. It took some collaborators to say, like, hey, you may not have had a dance practice for 20 years, but you had a movement practice for 20 years. It just happened to revolve around, can I put that ball in that hoop? Turns out the answer is not very often. But anyway.
Yeah, like disabled people deserve all the learning hacks, just the same way non-disabled people can show up to a ballet class. And I mean, ballet is a bad example. That technique does not work for the vast majority of bodies either. But they deserve all the advantages that they can get while building their technique and building their artistry.
I always find it interesting wheeling into dance studios and, walking past something like a bar and swinging over it, or, doing a dance project that was on a big ramp, thanks to the aforementioned Alice Shepherd, Dr. Pierce, Dr. Eels, folks like that, Harmony as well. So during this episode, we saw one company incorporating access into the performance itself, using things like lighting, stage design, and script in this really interesting way. Are there any favorite examples of accessible creation that you've bumped into in your career when it comes to inclusive dance, whether you were involved or you just happen to be in the audience and go, because I've certainly done access stuff where I'm sitting there and I go, oh, I'm borrowing that with credit. I'm taking that into my next rehearsal hall.
Can I be nerdy and ask who it is?
Oh, of course. It's the dance ensemble for the National Access Arts Center.
Amazing. Okay. I've never seen their work, sadly, but I will trust that it's
a show called Iconic Plus that they did. So has things like very specific lighting and stage choices to make sure that one of the performers can find their space.
I mean, this is what I think about constantly in my work. I think there's examples where it's very obvious how the access is built in. There's also examples where the access is built into the choreography in ways you wouldn't necessarily see. I've only seen clips of their work, but Flatfoot Downy Dance in South Africa has this really cool, essentially like memory support technique where they will cue dance, other dancers will cue dancers through particular touch patterns that they've set up before. And that looks like part of the choreography. And you don't know until you talk to the company that they've built this really incredible scaffold for cognitive access into the choreography itself. On the side of like the beautiful integrated projections and audio description, I'm going to shout a show that I like very briefly consulted on, but I'm obsessed with, which is Stopgap Dance's Lived Fiction. It's incredible. There's really beautifully set up pre-performance information, which for me, I would argue is a part of the audience's encounter with the show and should be considered artistic access. And then there's integrated audio description delivered live on stage by Stopgap's access artist, Lily Norton. And all of that also has captioning and sound visualization made by Ben Glover, who's a deaf captioner. And one of the really stunning things about this piece is there's moments where the choreography and the access play off of each other. So there's this one particular duet I love where Christian Brinklow and Monique Diorgeret, Lily's giving the audio description and you can see them slow their movement to meet the audio description, or like pause and settle into shape and let them describe. So the audio description sort of becomes a third partner in the duet. I'm going to stop there because there's a lot, so many performances I could talk about.
We both have laundry lists, don't we?
Yes.
Is there a part of disability history that you wish we talked more about? And also, how do you think disability-led dance can help support sort of cataloging and highlighting that history?
I don't think I have a good answer for this. I think generally, I wish we talked about disability history more. Often disabled people are incredibly disconnected from their histories. And I think really specifically, often disabled artists are disconnected from their histories. I think especially working in England where disability arts is not easily part of the mainstream, but there's certainly a certain level of support and understanding around it. I often feel like younger artists are very disconnected from the early days of disability art performance, where it was very much about disabled people performing for other disabled people. Sometimes I wonder what it would mean to think about our histories of what disability art is doing.
That makes sense. Certainly looking at sort of disability history and disability cultural history and connecting. This is where I admit to the audience that I did an MFA looking at this in the prairies and how, you can find these touch points. But then when you start going a little further back, you start sort of, once you get like sort of pre-amici in some ways, to use another company that we mentioned in the show, you sort of end up with like, okay, who decided that they're disabled family member should be on stage or who created these spaces. And, as part of the mission of the show is that, we can't go back to the first disabled person to dance, because that's a bit like, who's the first person to have a diagnosis, like who's the first person to move creatively. But, we can look at these companies. You've done a lot of work with audience. How does creating access for an audience differ from creating access for the performers themselves? And how do you manage that sort of access friction?
I'm going to start with the slightest little bit of a rant. I think we think about these things as separate, and I actually think they're deeply symbiotic. Yeah, supporting access in one side of that equation usually will support access elsewhere. So that's the little rant. Disabled artists, as part of being artists, need to go see disability art. So access should always be a consideration. I think that the trick is when you're working with artists or arts workers, you're looking at working relationships and situations where it's going to be more than a few hours for the most part. There's some exceptions in film and TV. And that means there's an ongoing relationship between the people in the space. And you can try and talk to people and try things out and tweak things and try and adjust them if things don't work the first time. And I think people sometimes get worried about access clash. Certainly when I'm talking to non-disabled arts people here, they're always like, but what about access clash? As if that means that the world suddenly implodes. Disabled people deal with inaccessibility all the time. And actually, sometimes people, and I think this should be a choice, but sometimes for other disabled people are willing to choose some inaccessibility or some access clash in order to make the space work. But that needs to be a negotiation. Audiences, on the other hand, I love because it's a group of strangers, and it's a group of strangers who have particular stakes. And they want to have a good time. They want to be educated. They want to be moved. And they don't have a stake in having a relationship with the rest of the audience. So I think there's some things you start by really clearly communicating what is and isn't going to be there so people can decide if that's for them. And then you have to deliver that. So it goes back to this idea of the values of the space. There's some things you have to hold. But one of the things I'm increasingly interested in is sometimes disability performances invite audience members into relationships of care with other audience members. My research right now is around access for mostly audiences, but also artists with sensory sensitivities. So one of the things that sometimes performances made by artists with sensory sensitivities do is they say, what would it mean to find ways of expressing your joy and appreciation for performers that aren't loud? What can you do instead of clapping so that you're not introducing noise into the space that will be an access barrier for someone else? So I think audiences don't have relationships to each other in that presents some exciting access challenges. But also I think some of the cool places that disability performance is going is building relationships and audiences.
What do you think it would take for us to get to a space where we sort of as a society or even sort of as a disability set of communities were cataloging, highlighting, telling more of those historical disability stories?
So I think the baseline is we need more disability history. And I think more local disability histories. There's been really important efforts around particular groups, particular cities, particular sites to document the disability history in those places. So I think a lot about Berkeley is this particular site in disability history. And there's been incredible work done around that. In the UK, there's been big oral history projects around deinstitutionalization and also the Direct Action Network, which did a lot of really incredible protest work. But I also think I want other more local specific disability histories. So I'd love to imagine dancers staging this history of their city and who lived there, who created work there, who created art, who were the advocates. So I think there needs to be knowledge of that and a recognition that these stories are really important and should be preserved. And then because I'm endlessly fascinated by these questions, I think we start to get into questions around representation. And if we're representing specific figures from our history, what are the ethics around that? If you've got skills with mobility tools, probably I think that person needs somebody who used a mobility tool needs to be played by somebody with similar skills around that mobility tool, but also recognizing that we can never fully meet somebody else's unique individual embodiment. So how do we artistically acknowledge and honor those gaps while at the same time telling really important stories is a really exciting question to me.
Kelsie, if people want to learn more about your work and they want to find you on the internet that, as you said, disability community is so good at finding folks on, where can they find your work?
You can go to my staff profile at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama for a list of the nerdy academic things I've written recently. If you're interested in disability history, I'm going to shout out Critical Design Lab. And you can find my work on the Remote Access Archive, which we have not talked about at all, but is a particular repository of disabled people's histories on there. And CDL is much, much bigger than me. You can find my work and lots of other cool people's on that website.
Thank you so much, Kelsie.
Thank you. It's been my absolute pleasure.
Today's conversation shows how dance is about more than just movement, from challenging traditional ideas of technique to embedding access directly into creative practice. Inclusive dance reflects the innovation, resistance, and artistry at the heart of disability history. It's a story about disabled artists claiming space, expanding what performance can be, and creating work that continues to shape culture and community.
Thank you for tuning in to the companion podcast for AMI's History in 60. Be sure to watch History in 60 on AMI TV and online at AMI+. Join us next time as we continue exploring disability history and culture in Canada. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing, downloading, and sharing it with someone who might learn from these stories. Every listen and view helps amplify disability history and the voices shaping change today.